Um, Hello, everyone. I'm Trip Jennings with New Mexico in Depth. Thank you for joining us this Wednesday morning. We are very excited to have two guests along with us. I'm Trip Jennings, the Executive Director of New Mexico in Depth. You guys know me from previous calls, Zoom calls. I'm joined by Managing Editor Marjorie Childress. And we have Charles Sallee, who is the current director, the director of the Legislative Finance Committee, which is the legislature's budget arm. And we are joined by David Abbey, who is the former director of the Legislative Finance Committee. For those people who are joining us for the first time, if you have questions throughout this, we ask you to enter the questions in the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to them as quickly as possible. What we hope to do with today's call is really kind of there are a couple of things. We want to get just like where we are in the session as far as the state budget, and the negotiations that are happening right now. But also we want to have a conversation about the potential risks to New Mexico and its finances with the new administration and the resolution that passed the U.S. House of Representatives on February 25th. There are so many unknowns, but it's important to begin having these conversations, we feel. So, with that introduction, Charles, can you, because you're in the in the middle of the maelstrom, actually, which is it's kind of crazy up there this time of session. Can you give us a sense of where we are on, the budget negotiations? How close are um, the legislature and the governor on finalizing the budget? And I know you can't put too fine a point on it, but if you could just give us a sense of that.
Thanks for having me, Trip. And sure, but I really want to start with last year coming out of the session, because that's really when this budget started getting developed for the LFC. And just for your viewers, it's important to understand our context of how we developed the budget in New Mexico, because it's somewhat unique. There's only a handful of states that have got a separate legislative budget proposal that gets submitted to the full legislature from the governors. And the
Yep.
LFC
Yep.
really starts its work coming out of the session with staff work plans, hearing items, traveling around the state, hearing from constituents and local officials, studying issues, and then in September, starting to build the budget. And so the idea of the legislature putting together a budget proposal in 30 or 60 days, I tell people, well, they ask, how do you do that? And I was like, well, we don't. It's a much longer development process. And that's really important for, volunteer board of directors for the state of New Mexico, our legislators. That really gives them a leg up, in my view, for being able to balance out power with the executive branch the best we can under these circumstances. So that's really important, because if your viewers come up to Santa Fe or watch on Zoom, they would have seen the first couple of weeks in House Appropriations, the competing budget proposals, with basically HAFC using the LFC budget as the basis for the vast majority of spending, and then making adjustments from there.
I mean, can I just say, Charles? I mean, I think this is the way in springtime, right after the session, you start asking agencies to begin preparing their proposals. And somewhere around July, you guys really start getting into the meat of that, as I recall, where you just
Yeah,
look.
September 1st is when we get agencies' formal
Oh,
budget proposals, but
okay.
there's a lot of work going on all throughout the interim before we get to that point. Everything from program evaluations, performance report cards. Why are we doing this? Why is the legislature appropriating money? Well, it wants to accomplish something at the end of the day. And so we've
Mhm.
got a pretty sophisticated apparatus to help identify whether we're in fact accomplishing what people of the state of New Mexico want with all of this revenue. The other important context is coming into this session. We've had this enormous revenue boom coming out of 2016, 2017, really starting in 2018 and 2019. That is unprecedented. And a lot of it is driven by oil production, the likes of which we've never seen before. Up until that point, for 40 years, New Mexico would produce about 70 million barrels of oil a year. Last year we produced 700 million. So, we've had this roller coaster history as a state of boom and bust cycles. Folks can go on our homepage and see an interactive graphic going back to the 1960s of all of our general fund revenues. So what's been going on since that boom started in FY19? Well, I think of our general fund revenues, which are pretty complicated. I put them in three big buckets. The first is our revenues that are tied to our general economic prosperity. These are things like personal income taxes, gross receipts taxes, purchasing goods and service. The second are direct energy revenues. That's very volatile, and that's a very large source of revenue coming into our general fund. And the third are our investment income, where many states don't have the kind of permanent funds we do that spin off oil and gas revenue back into our general fund in a very stable environment. So those three buckets are really important because the first bucket, coming out of COVID, we've got a very strong economy, probably held back by our low labor force participation. It could otherwise be stronger. But the legislature has taken most of that strength and maybe even a little bit more, and they pushed it back out into the economy in the form of tax cuts and other tax code changes. Gross receipts taxes, child tax credit, working families, a lot of them were general tax decreases, some of them were transfer payments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The second is they've taken the volatile oil revenues and they've essentially capped them and put them into permanent funds. The first one was the Early Childhood Services Permanent Fund, Trust Fund. And what's important about that is when we, and David and I were in our basement down here working with people to help concoct that thing. And, we had hoped for building that reserve up to $1 billion over a 5 or 6 year period. Well, it's heading north of $10 billion right now.
It's
Totally
incredible. Yeah.
unpredicted, but good for the state because we're taking that volatile revenue and it's going to be available for the next generation to fund a suite of hopefully early childhood services that will help us turn direction over a generation in a better way. The next is our severance tax permanent fund, where the legislature said basically take all this oil revenue above FY24 and cap it and put it into the permanent fund. And by the end of this decade, if the investment returns are solid, our investment returns will be as large, if not larger, than our energy revenues. So you
Oh,
talked about you're not ending the dependence on oil and gas. That's not going to happen anytime soon. But in terms of like balancing out our revenue streams, that's pretty big. But what do all those things do between tax cuts, big spending increases, 61% before this budget gets enacted? So that's where a lot of the surplus is going. What does that mean for the near term and the midterm? It means revenue growth has slowed dramatically to almost flat to 3%, which means the budget writers can't afford to keep writing budgets that grow 15, 10% a year. And so you see an LFC coming out at about 5.6% spending growth with new budget strategies of let's pilot things before we put it into the base budget for a couple of years. So that's how they're able to hold CYFD's budget basically flat and say, but still fund all of the things that they need to do to improve their caseworkers, improve the quality of their caseworkers, is funded through a multi-year pilot project. So big surpluses are being spread out over time. And then you've got what's going on in the House. They came out at about 5.7% with a stated public goal of holding spending down at around 6. We'll see if that holds in the Senate. If they can do that, they can spread this surplus out over 5 to 6 years and afford to be able to do big non-recurring items for things like cash financing, a good portion of capital outlay, a big portion of the 3.1 billion in non-recurring are actually savings accounts that are part of our reserves. It just shows up as spending. And then do things that improve the quality of life for our state. Everything from crime fighting to actually getting clean drinking water projects done, where we've got a good number of projects in the queue that don't have funding. We can fund those shovel-ready projects in ways that we couldn't fund before.
so
So that's where we're at now. The House has already acted in a very bipartisan way, came out with only one no vote out of HAFC, bipartisan floor vote, very orderly, evidence informed, in contrast to what you're seeing in Washington right now. That's already playing out in Senate Finance's deliberations, where they're going through in a methodical way what the House has done. And the Senate's going to put their stamp on it, and then they'll have to come to an agreement with the governor before sending it up.
Hmm. So, okay, can I say real quick? I just want to take a step back when you were talking about the permanent funds and how they contribute to the budget. I think right now, and let me say this for those listeners, maybe not on this call, but people who will maybe find our post when we post it on our website and try to maybe or want to be educated about the budget process. In some ways, the permanent funds that have been there for decades. This is kind of like if you had as a family $2 million and you decided, hey, you know what, we're not going to touch the $2 million, it'll produce interest and we'll try to contribute, we'll try to live off the interest. That's what the permanent funds have been doing for decades. And this strategy of creating the workforce, I mean, I'm sorry, the early childhood trust fund, similar model, which is we're building this up, we're going to live off the interest, not touch the corpus or the principal. That's what you're talking about here.
That's
So
correct.
we can stabilize the funding of New Mexico in the decades to come because the oil and gas industry is boom and bust, and we don't know where the markets are headed over the next 40 or 50 years, frankly. We just don't know, right? That's
And there's two things. One, it allows for the amount of taxes on the general population to be lower than they otherwise would be to afford this level of spending or redistribution through the tax code. That's the
okay.
first big thing that it allows for.
Yeah.
And it's why our property taxes are the lowest in the country.
Yeah.
But then we're like a mid to top tier state in funding schools. It's like, how do you do that? Well, in part because of these permanent funds. The
So,
second is by
all right.
setting those excess revenue streams into the permanent funds, the shocks of an oil and gas bust will be felt by those permanent funds first before
Mm-hmm.
the general fund. So they have an insulating effect like we've never had before. Whereas
Oh,
before, throughout Mr. Abbey's career, if oil prices dropped from, like before the Great Recession from 115 down and just crashed, we felt all of that. It's
yeah.
like, you hear that rule of thumb, $1 a barrel equals like 50 million.
Yeah.
Well, during his tenure, that was real. And that would keep us up at night, especially when we were putting the final touches on the budget right before over Thanksgiving and December, where we'd have to go in and cut the budget in a significant way if that volatility. Now I sleep like a baby. I worry about stuff, but I know that, and in fact, it just happened. They revised the oil forecast down from August to December, and the general fund revenue estimate didn't change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean,
So,
yeah. And let me ask you this too. So we've got the permanent funds, we've got these trust funds that go into that help fund agencies, but you also have operating reserves, which is over and above the general fund and recurring funds. Really the great the 1617 situation, I think that Marty talked about at the what we were talking about before the call, where you really had to go in and you could see it almost in real time. You had to start cutting. There was a special session in I think late September of 2016 where it was just all hands on deck. That really led the legislature to kind of go, we need to build up our operating reserves because, frankly, the rating agencies that are going to rate states as far as their risk, like investors, look at risk. If you downgrade a state or a government, it becomes more expensive to actually debt finance. Basically, you send out debt. Right now, as I recall, is it like $3 billion in the debt, operating reserves? Is that
yeah,
correct?
there'll be over $3 billion. The LFC came in with a target of 33% reserves, which was signaling that they were leaving money before needing to rearrange the budget available for the full legislature to meet a reserve target of 30%. And where does that number come from? And it comes from our career economist actually performing stress tests on the revenues, where they're saying, what if oil hits a catastrophic $40 a barrel and that's sustained for a period of time? How much
Right.
money do you as policymakers want to have available before you got to go in and start cutting budgets or rearranging things? And so
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
a
So
tolerance level of where, in the past, 5% was seen as sufficient. And then it was like, you know what, we got burned by that. Let's do 10 and see if we can, how that works. And then we got burned by that. And then it was like, well, 25 and then now 30. Is there
I
any
mean,
precise number? I mean, it's really informed by these what if scenarios. And
I
the
was going to
reserves,
mention that.
yeah.
Yeah. I
So
mean, go ahead, Margie. Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to ask, maybe to expand a little bit. So we wanted to talk a little bit about federal dollars today. So the budget that you're talking about, so you're putting together the budget. So a lot of people don't know how much federal dollars help support all those services that you mentioned. So like state agencies, programs, they're also bringing in federal dollars. So when state lawmakers put together the budget, what we're talking about is all of the revenues coming into the state, like taxes, the oil and gas money from these different funds. And so there's money that the state's gathering, and we're creating this budget with what we have at our disposal. And then there's all this federal money coming in too. And then altogether, that creates a much larger budget. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like?
sure. So like the recurring ongoing budget, like for a family or monthly expenses, that's at about 10.8 billion. That's where the House Bill 2 is sitting right now. We've got a series of earmarked revenues that come in to the state, like the road fund, that are earmarked for specific purposes. When you buy a hunting or fishing license, that goes into a special revenue. And then we've got federal funds, which amount to about 14 billion. And Medicaid alone will account for about 9 billion of those. Some of them are matching. You put up a certain amount of money and the federal government will give you a share. Others are block grants where the federal government says, we're just giving you 100 million a year, regardless of how much your costs are to operate that program. Others are discretionary grants that we may know about, where an agency applies to a federal agency for money to carry out a specific purpose, and then builds that into the budget.
And so
The
when
last time, go ahead,
Well,
Margie.
so when people talk about Medicaid, that's like a federal match, so it's like automatic, right? So how much we spend, then that triggers that money.
But
Are
then,
and
yes,
that
the federal
that is
government needs to approve like your state plan of what services you're going to provide. If you've got a waiver from that state plan because you're deviating from federal regulations or law and they're waiving it to pay for something that normally we couldn't pay for under the regular Medicaid program, that all gets approved by the federal government. And then there's formulas for how much certain services will be reimbursed by the federal government. So administration might be a 50-50, whereas the expansion population of able-bodied adults without kids, the feds will fund up to 90% of that.
And the expansion is what you're talking about with the ACA expansion that
Yes.
happened back in 2014, 2015, 90%. And generally though, Medicaid, generally, just if add it all, multiply it and divide it, it's generally $1 of state spending is more than $3. It triggers more than $3 back from the federal government, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. It's
so
important for us to know this. Yeah.
we have a one question, or it's a comment from Patsy Romero. She says, I am concerned that we overspend our state funds when the federal decisions could substantially impact the sustainability for our Medicaid services and other earmarked expenditures. My observation is that we are moving to spend without taking a conservative approach to maintaining a strong permanent fund. So thank you, Patsy, for weighing in.
Hi, Patsy. Thank you.
So I think, so that kind of, in a way, it leads to my next question, Charles, is what are you hearing? Are people up at the Roundhouse right now? Is there developing the budget. We're kind of in the end weeks here for getting it over the finish line. And we just had basically the US House of Representatives pass a budget resolution that is calling for $2 trillion in cuts. And the main areas they've identified, one of them, the biggest one, is one of their committees that constructs the budget of Medicaid as part of it. So, I mean, are you hearing a lot of conversation? I mean, we had a committee hearing in Senate Finance on Monday where economists kind of gave a presentation about this, but do you hear a lot of people talking about the possibility that there's going to be the need to come back because there's going to be drastic cuts, or, I mean, what are you like hearing or thinking?
Sure. I mean, there's pretty strong rhetoric coming out of DC. Actual legislation that's passed the House hasn't passed in the same format of the Senate in terms of a budget blueprint. Details still forthcoming and to be worked out. But if you were to take just on face value the House budget resolution for Medicaid alone, that's they've been directed to find 13% cuts in federal Medicaid spending. That amounts to about 1.1 billion. So we shouldn't really kid ourselves about trying to go full bore on expanding spending. We should be really focused on protecting what we've got and being prepared to prioritize if there are cutbacks, because I don't think we are going to be in a good position to backfill everything that the federal government says they don't want to fund anymore. So I think that prioritization is going to be really important. And I've already got a list of things to look at, with members. But it's also hard to know, on the spending side, the Biden administration came in with very thin majorities, but feeling from their base, who had just had elected them, that they needed to do big spending increases that they didn't achieve through reconciliation. So, risks that we need to be prepared for. That's why you want to keep reserves where they're at, not just for oil and gas, but for, the dependence on federal revenue. And that dependence extends beyond what you see in the state budget. We're seeing that play out with exposure for federal employees that work in our state. What are the effects of somebody not really paying attention and laying off a bunch of workers permitting federal oil wells in southeast New Mexico? What does that do? I mean, you got to really start digging into all of these different things. But we'll see that process play out, and we're prepared.
I wanted to bring David into the conversation because, David, you went through as director, the first Trump term, and there was a lot of noise coming out of Washington. I remember some bills that were filed and would have cut back on some. Gosh, I can't remember all this stuff, but you have a perspective, a historical perspective on this, in the sense that you were involved in the budget process back in the first term where there was a lot of strong rhetoric. Now you're an observer, you're retired, enjoying your retirement, not having to sweat every day up at the session like Charles. But I mean, what is your perspective on, what New Mexico, just where we are in planning, as someone who has many decades in this as well?
Well, the crisis in beginning in 15, 16, 17 was on the revenue side primarily. The federal funds, you might think back that it was a problem, but no, it was the broad economy and oil and gas. And the numbers were big, and you've talked about it already, that there came a point where the state didn't have any reserves.
Mm-hmm.
40 years ago, we thought 5% reserves was enough, and then 10, and then 20, and 30 is a number that kind of makes sense with the stress testing that LFC is doing. So first of all, we're in a better position because of that. Charles did a nice job of explaining why we're less vulnerable to oil and gas volatility, because the first thing it hits is the savings flow rather than the spending.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But these dollars are really big. Charles didn't quite say it, but well, he said 1.1 billion. and you add to that TANF and food stamps and so forth, and you know, it's on the order of the kind of revenue impact we had in 16, 17. It's really big. And I think also as we look back at that history, you look back and say, gosh, we should have been more cautious. And frankly, that was the time between Governor Martinez and the fiscal leadership in the legislature, where it was easier for them to be, or more natural for them to be cautious than they are today. But I look at spending. You know, we've grown spending in the range of 10% about 3 years in a row. We've had, in addition to the recurring spending, Charles called it 6%, but the so-called non-recurring spending is more than, call that in the range of 10 to 15%. Much of that is recurring. So to me, it's kind of echoing what Patsy Romero said. It is a big red flag in terms of expanding government at a time where we face these reductions. So
Yeah, so this is in a sense what we faced in 2016, 2017. That whole area was really, like you said, it was the bust of the oil and the boom bust cycle. What I mean is the barrels, the value of oil just really dropped. And there was rhetoric coming out of Washington, but that didn't, I don't recall it actually being as potentially um large as some of this stuff coming out of Washington this time. I just, I don't remember the first Trump term, that administration actually having a plan coming in the first 6 weeks. It was a lot of chaos, you know.
that's right. The federal reductions weren't, but between the recession and severe weakness in the oil and gas
Yeah.
economy, the revenue reductions were on the scale of the reductions of the federal funds that we're facing, you know, 10 to
Mm,
15%
mm,
that the LFC report to Senate Finance projected as plausible with the House budget resolution.
mhm, mhm.
So similar order of magnitude, we're in better position to deal with it, but it's still really big with choices. And I totally agree with Charles. We're not necessarily in a position to backfill every lost federal dollar.
Mhm.
So
We've
what
been,
happens in that case? I mean, how did lawmakers deal with the budget gap back then, given that they didn't have enough reserves that they needed?
well, you know, every possible option, you know, over the course of a decade. I mean, it was also 2009 and 2010. And so sanding, passing, and you're right, Marjorie, about the challenge lawmakers remember when their very first vote was cutting a budget that had already passed for a year that was half over. You know,
Mm-hmm.
sanding current year budgets, much less future year budgets, raiding every account they could find. There's still a tough memory in school districts about the idea that the state grabbed back school district cash balances.
Mhm. I remember that.
I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
still a sore point. And even though today's school district cash balances are very flush, like in, you know, 15 to 20% range, you know, the memory is there and perhaps causing them to be cautious. So let's see, you know, borrowing money, taking money we borrowed to pay off projects that we'd already paid for. There was a lot of creative financing going on that
Yeah.
that frankly there was no choice.
Can,
And
can,
and
can,
this was at a time where, well, there was the revenue outlook was uncertain. Is it going to get worse or not? Turns out the worst fears weren't realized, but they caused folks to be very concerned. And even then, there was pressure to cut taxes, even though the economy was weak. The Martinez administration was really pushing an agenda like that, which, of course, by the way, that's what Washington is looking at. Look
Mm-hmm.
at Politico today, and you've got the chairman of the House Ways and Means just salivating to do massive tax cuts at the time these spending cuts are coming down the pike, and at a time maybe we're facing another round of recession. So plenty of, back to Patsy Romero's point, plenty of time, plenty of reason to kind of rein in our desire to do more and more expansions. And I think I look at what we call Charles will call the back of the bill, not the recurring budget growing 6%, but the 3 billion of spending on sort of one-time things, but also recurring things. And it's like, are you sure you want to start all those things now? There are of all things, Medicaid waivers, request to fund waivers to expand services when you know Congress is facing unwinding the ones we already have.
One thing as we prepared for this call, one thing we did touch on that this is um, the budget resolution that passed, the $2 trillion in cuts that the House called for, the House majority, and let's recall that it passed 217 to 215. It's really close in the House, and I'm assuming that the cuts to Medicaid, we do not know what that's going to look like, but there's going to be a lot of pushback from across, I think, the political spectrum on how deep to go on Medicaid, because there are going to be people who I know in my own life, people who voted for Donald Trump who are probably on Medicaid for various reasons, because it pays for everything from nursing home stays for people in low income, behavioral health, people struggling with mental health and addiction, medical assistance programs. So much is in Medicaid, and every state is, will be affected, including folks in Republican districts that elected Republicans to Congress. So I think there is a larger conversation about Charles. You mentioned the rhetoric coming out of Washington. This may be rhetoric, but really the details, that's going to be the tell, right? The budget negotiations, what people hear from what Congress people in the House and the Senate hear from their constituents. That's going to help define how large the spending cuts are, right?
Yeah, I mean, they've got policy choices that have been presented by my counterparts, in the CBO for years. And they're all politically, being potentially taken off the table like immediately, like, doing a Medicaid as a block grant. They
Hmm.
call them like a per capita basis. Changing the matching rates with states. They were all on lists that have been circulating around Congress. The political viability of those shrinks very fast in order to get to that narrow margin of victory. And then you're left with a list that doesn't even come close to $80 billion a year. So, I mean, they've got their work cut out for them to not kick people off, not close down the ACA, to not change the FMAP, and not block grant it. That's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse that you'd have to assume would come in. That said, they're also looking at a 10-year budget window. There's
Hmm.
lots of different things you can do with that and assumptions that you can make. Sort of like push the hard decisions out
Exactly.
as
Yes.
the first order of business. So it's not to say that they wouldn't attempt to do those things, but in the next 2 years, it maybe not. But then there should be opportunities in any government program for savings,
Hmm.
and we shouldn't shy away from that as a state either, because we're putting
Mhm.
up New Mexicans tax dollars, and we don't want those wasted either. So we
So
should
let,
continue to do our due diligence with being efficient and, most importantly, effective. I mean, this program's serving more than 40% of our state. And what are we getting for it as a population? We're spending over $1 billion on behavioral health care. Why are we still seeing the things that we're seeing on the street corners? I mean, is it a lack of money, or is it something else?
hmm hmm I want to go back and just say, so maybe people who don't know, right now, there's really, I don't think, any general cap on Medicaid spending that states do. So a block grant would restrict it to a certain amount for each state, and they would have to live within that budget. And if they wanted to go over it, the state would have to pick up the extra. because
Or cut somewhere else.
yeah, or cut somewhere else. That's exactly right. They've done this with other federal programs, the grant kind of model, and then the matching is what we're kind of talking about with the $1 that New Mexico spends. You get more than three. They could change the rates there, which would require New Mexico to pay more. Basically, I just wanted to make sure that everybody understood on the call, and people who come later maybe watch it on later. I,
Hey, Trip, just let me give you an example of a Medicaid cut. Charles hit them generally, but we're getting a 90% match for the expansion population, maybe 150, 200,000 people, many of them adults. So first of all, they're going to want adults. It's almost irresistible for them to look at adults, able-bodied adults to work.
oh, okay.
That's gonna be just raise a lot of issues, but it's in some ways, to me, that will look like low-hanging fruit for the majority
Right.
in
Or they might put
Congress.
work requirements.
Yeah, low-hanging fruit. And second, the expansion population, again, mostly adults, are getting matched at 90%. But most states only get 50%. So I just see a lot of pressure for them to lower, if not all the way to the state. Our state average is 75 or so, Charles, 74, something like that.
Yeah.
The expansion population. Well, for other states, it'll go from 90 to 50. They're going to get a lot of savings that way. So, you look at the vote. Yes, it was a very close vote, 217 to 215, but, just watching the fallout from the speech last night, you've got the Speaker of the House just talking about having a party line vote. Party line vote in the House, they're going to be able to do these things where that you can identify individual Republican congressmen who are very anxious about this, Nebraska and New York congressmen from those places. But then what do they do when Trump calls? That's why they're able to pass that budget resolution 217 to 215, because Trump got on the phone and lobbied them extremely. And anyway, I think my point is, even though we know there are pockets of the congressional majority who are concerned about Medicaid cuts, I wouldn't underestimate the ability to muscle them.
Mhm. Right.
The work requirements are the most likely change that I see for getting through.
Because they did that with TANF a couple of decades ago, as I recall.
Well, and TANF had work requirements. They weren't as stringent as what they made it. And then that used to be an entitlement, the matching fund. And then Congress capped it and said, New Mexico, you're only getting, what we got back then was 100 million a year. We're still getting it.
And then the work requirements are a way for them to do what you were talking about, I think, Charles, around the projections they can make over 10 years, because work requirements are a way to reduce the population on Medicaid.
Well, sure. If you're, the population, the expansion population on Medicaid, their income is capped at 135% of the federal poverty level, which is very, very low. We've done research, and I'm trying to tease out by population, but we issued a report a couple of years ago that found, 62% of people on Medicaid that were adults were working. I need to tease out how many of the expansion population alone. But basically that population, if they are working, they're underemployed. And so if you put a work requirement of at least 30 hours a week, let's say, and your prevailing, unskilled labor wage in communities is $14 or $15 an hour, you don't qualify for Medicaid very fast. And then the state would need to be prepared to help move them into the exchange where they would get, a subsidy for low wage workers. But that's where they would achieve significant federal savings, is through ways of moving folks either off of the Medicaid altogether because they were working too much and earning too much. And the question would be, would that result in large numbers of uninsured people nationally, which has a whole range of implications for the healthcare system.
Right.
or would it result in them being on a different plan that maybe is more appropriate?
You know, in covering budgets over the years, this is a general rule I've always heard, which is if you, and I saw this during the Richardson administration here in New Mexico, if you require Medicaid recipients, let's say Medicaid, to actually re-enroll every, I think it was 6 months instead of every 12 months, you're gonna lose some folks because every time you put a challenge to or access to a program, it's gonna reduce the number of people who re-enroll. So that's how I think about the work requirements, which is that's part of that.
We'll see
Uh,
the same thing in nutrition programs. Those are low-hanging fruit for them as well, where the Biden administration had moved to make it much easier for people to afford a higher amount on SNAP, or for kids to qualify for free meals in school, where they basically said you only have to have 40% of your kids enrolled on free and reduced lunch to do the paperwork, and the other 60 can get free and reduced free lunch as a result. It's kind of like these administrative quirks that we're trying to expand those programs to people that otherwise wouldn't have qualified. I see those are on all the lists to roll back.
Mhm.
Express
I,
lane eligibility, you qualify for this public assistance program, you automatically qualify for another one. So expanding what I call the hassle factor is an
mhm.
attempt to decrease enrollments.
I want to turn, if it's okay with you guys, we do have several questions from folks. Susie Crowley asked, and we're going to move to a different section of the budget. What impact will the federal changes of funding programs have on state budgets and then by extension on university budgets and allocations?
Well, the first thing is they're looking at reconciliation is limited to what are called mandatory programs. So those are things that are like Social Security, Medicare, where they're kind of like on autopilot. They are not subject to the annual appropriations process. That could infer. So for the big one, what we just talked about was Medicaid, nutrition programs, where it will impact higher education on the budget reconciliation side could be through any student financial aid programs is the first thing that comes to mind.
Pell Grants,
You
that kind of,
know,
yeah.
those types of things, loan repayments. There was a lot of attempts by the administration to change how those work to provide more loan forgiveness. The dollars in aggregate don't even come close to rivaling the Medicaid dollars in those areas. But that's what you'll see there. Administrative issues in how the federal government administers money that Congress has appropriated for certain research. That's really in the unknown for whether they will reduce those or certainly curtail spending. I mean, the administration has certainly tried to cut off grant spending, even though it's been authorized by Congress. So some risks there with some of those research grants, especially depending on what kind of research grants they are. If they touch on any of those hot button issues,
Yeah. So with the Pell Grant and scholarship programs, what that could mean, I think I hear you saying, or maybe I'm reading too much into it, is that it might mean fewer students for UNM or fewer students for NMSU, or is that a possibility? And that affects funding. That affects funding.
well, what it would mean would be anchoring the amount of student could get to a different formula than what it's currently,
Mm,
to basically decrease how much a student can get depending on the school that they're attending. So if they're attending a really high cost school and Pell was tied to the cost of that school's attendance, the food and board and tuition, then anchoring that to an average for
hmm
all institutions. So some of the higher cost schools have more exposure there than maybe our universities on Pell in particular.
hmm
So we have a number of questions stacking up, so maybe we should read a couple of them together and then um, ask for you guys can respond. So we have Patsy Romero again. She's going back to the block grants for Medicaid, and she's wondering, is New Mexico at risk for having the federal government take states' reserves into consideration? Which is an interesting question. And then Hakeem Bellamy says, congruent to Patsy's line of questioning, Will decisions to force certain states to tap their reserves be based upon the political affiliation of the state's governor? And if so, is that legal under the carrot versus the stick approach to federal influence? Read federalism.
I'll take a stab at the question about reserves. That would be very complicated, which kind of, I think, argues against trying that. Also, the red states are going to have more reserves and are going to be more resistant to taking those credits. So, like basically what the state and the legislature faces is a wide range of risks. So I wouldn't say there's no risk, but I'd put that at the lower end. And clearly, the state needs to focus on the highest risk and the highest dollar amounts. So that question about, for example, Pell Grants and how it affect, graduate awards for students, those are going to be very important to individuals and to the universities. But at the state level, they're not going to be of the same importance as the big programs with the large dollars like Medicaid, food stamps, and TANF, and perhaps child care block grants and so forth.
Okay, and then we have Steffi Weisberg. 15% F and A for grants are going to hurt universities. Already pulling back on offers to graduate students. State already subsidize our university. That's a comment. And then Alen Gush says, the Medicaid issue is terrifying, but then they're talking about closing Social Security offices and getting rid of Social Security workers while the number of workers is already inadequate. I know you're not psychics, but how do you see the likelihood of that happening? And is there any way you see that we could counter it?
Well, Marjorie, I'm going to say, in terms of cutting Social Security, forget it. They may be, not maybe, they were understaffed before, just like the IRS. So there's going to be a massive logjam of administrative issues at those offices that's going to affect New Mexicans. But from a budgetary standpoint, not so much. But I really like Roy Soto's question. You skipped that one, and
well, I was going to come back to it.
Let's see what Charles has to say about that one. I like that question.
So,
Okay.
you want to read it, Marjorie?
Sure. So Roy Soto says it was more like vacuuming rather than sanding back then. So Roy's talking about the 2016 period. During David's tenure, the legislature was more conservative, and now in Charles's tenure, it's far more progressive. Does that impact the development of the budget and how the LFC approaches budget policies?
Sure. I mean, at the same time, LFC came out with a budget recommendation that continued to be lower than the executive branches. Had more in savings. So, the more members are on LFC and are exposed to the full breadth of fiscal and policy as well as performance challenges, the more they're becoming focused on making sure that every dollar counts. Whereas other standing committees don't have to worry about balancing their kind of primary. Well, let's look at schools as a good example of where schools develop like a separate budget recommendation from LFC, but they don't have the same kind of constraints that LFC has on meeting certain spending targets or certain constraints. And that creates challenges, since I began, the folks on Health and Human Services and the advocates are always saying fully fund Medicaid. I never quite understand what that exactly means, but it creates a challenge. This legislature and this group of legislators, many of them are very new, so they haven't had this kind of experience, and so they're hearing from folks who have been around, but they haven't had to experience it yet. So it remains to be seen how they would react politically if something catastrophic happened. The good news is we're set up in a much different way than we were in 2016 and 2017.
You find that, so I
Can I
remember.
add to that, Marjorie, just real quickly? I think a big change also is reducing taxes is much, much lower on the menu. And even when things were tight, and even under the Richardson administration, there was interest in cutting taxes as
Mhm.
he had a
Mhm.
national agenda. So that's a change.
That's interesting. And I was just gonna, just pose kind of an idea that, so, from like 2010, for like a decade, you just watching the State House, there was this real kind of tug of war over the land grant permanent fund. And you had a progressive movement to tap it further for early childhood. And then you had, I always think of it as led by John Arthur Smith, this kind of Dr. No thing he had going on. And there was just this real kind of loggerheads over it. And that has successfully happened. It has been tapped for slightly more, or it was at the time. That was before they developed this new trust fund for early childhood. But the progressive leaders in the House and the Senate today lived through that period. I mean, they were at the session during the 2016 shaving and sanding, or the pulling back. So they're part of the cadre of lawmakers who kind of lived through that
You mean
experience.
the leaders, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and they're like progressive leaders of both chambers. I mean, they're considered in the progressive wing. So, and then we've seen now this socking away of the money into these trust funds, rather than spending it. So do you think that maybe just that experience that people had in 2016 kind of informed, I mean, just across the political,
COVID,
spectrum?
COVID too. COVID. COVID also was a big issue, right? As far as having to respond to stuff, in addition to the 2016, 2017 stuff.
There just seems to be a more of an emphasis on saving and stocking away money for the future. That's the way I would put it as a layperson. I mean, that across the spectrum, there seems to be a lot of agreement about it.
I would agree with that. I think have moved into an era where, from my advice to the committee, is to think about the midterm. I think we've got the long term covered. It's hard to capitalize with 1 year surplus or 2 years surplus, these permanent funds, and we've got a ton of them. And at the same time, you've got today needs where there's frankly capacity constraints to make meaningful difference on the ground. But I worry about the midterm, the next 5 to 6 years of needing to kind of turn our economy in a different direction, because the long-term fiscal outlook is not dreary, but the revenue growth is less than what it was under Martinez and Johnson. And you just described that was an austere time that, caused a lot of political issues. And so I think that's why you're seeing, we'll see if it happens through the end of the session, kind of a pausing on taxes. My point to the committee is what do you hope to accomplish, and how will you know you've accomplished it? Because you've done a lot over the past couple of years. And if it's just like everybody gets a little, is that really what you want to do to hasten the day that you're building budgets to only grow 3%? Because it has the same effect as growing the budget, 6 to 10%. You're reducing revenues by some equal amount. So you got to make that count just as much as you do on the spending.
Yeah, because yeah, the thing that we've learned over the years is that the budget is the revenue side and the spending side. They go hand in hand. And if you take away, I think David, maybe you mentioned, or Charles, I know Marjorie, we've talked about this. Richardson did. He changed the whole personal income tax structure back during his tenure, which took some stuff off out of the revenue side, as it were. We have a couple of questions I want to get to. Elizabeth Dixon. Hi, Elizabeth. This is back to a Medicaid question. In regards to Medicaid reductions, how do you anticipate that will impact school district budgets that bill Medicaid for student services? Is that something that could happen? I mean, I guess it could happen, but
Yeah, I think the biggest potential impact on those types of things would be changing the matching rates, which we've
Mm-hmm.
said are going to be very hard.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I have not seen any specific kind of proposals floating around Congress at that level of detail. They're kind of at the higher level work requirements, waste, fraud, and abuse, caps for this or that, but not at the school-based health center or the school reimbursement for special education.
You know, kind of which kind of gets to your point, which is, yeah, they've got this framework that they just passed, which is the resolution, and they've got a 10-year window to save this money. You know, maybe in the year 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, you know, the harder stuff is going to be, I would imagine, put off. That's my sense of watching budgets being made, is if legislators, state, federal, get the chance, um, because these questions are often difficult and they involve lawmakers' constituents. They'll probably put it off. But that's me. I know maybe you guys can't say that, but I would
Well,
imagine.
you see it all the time with this process, this budget reconciliation, where they'll extend a certain amount of tax cuts in order to get it through. Remember, this whole process is designed to get around the Senate filibuster,
Mm-hmm.
designed to get around the normal appropriations process by saying if we can still meet these parameters under the Budget Act, then we don't have to get a supermajority in the Senate. And so there you'll see things like, well, these tax cuts will cost a certain amount, but only for 5 years in order to fit underneath a certain budget window. And then they know that they're kicking the can, that if they want to make them permanent, which is a discussion right now, that's under the rules of the Senate in particular, very, very expensive. You know, this whole plan that they passed still increases the federal deficit
Oh,
significantly.
yeah,
So it's not
right,
like, all these budget cuts would be to balance the budget.
right, right.
And there's some even discussion about ignoring extending the Trump tax cuts, which don't actually cut taxes. All it does is keep what he's done on the books.
Right.
So you see no change with some of these things in what you're paying in taxes. Now there's some new proposals, but the bulk of it is maintaining what they had done in 2017.
In essence, I think what I'm hearing you say, as somebody who's covered so many budgets, is this is about how many votes you can get. This is about vote counting, right? Basically, this is can you get a majority? What I'm trying to say is, what you were just saying. It's some of these things would be so controversial that they would lose votes.
Yeah.
So, you know, basically, this is in many ways, because budget making is political like everything else, in a legislature and a Congress. So
My bigger concern is the continuing resolution coming to an end
mm,
and government shutdown,
okay,
and not
okay,
being able to come to an agreement on just extending what they've got and wanting, then you've got the Doge kind of groups coming in wanting to kind of make permanent some of the things that you've seen going on, or go deeper, that
hmm,
are very politically controversial, that cause the government shutdown to last longer.
oh wow.
The
How
debt
does the
ceiling is
government,
part of the equation.
so Charles, how does a government shutdown affect New Mexico's budget?
Can I say
Well,
real quick? Can I say we might almost we might go a few minutes over if that's okay, because this stuff is so
yeah.
interesting. I've already talked to Bettina, who's running our recording, because this is really important stuff that people would like to know. We have a outstanding question too,
Well,
but
the most immediate is like if you go hiking on Hyde Park, you're not going to be able to use the latrines. That's like immediate impact to people being to access their federal government for a range of services. But for New Mexico state government, we need to roll up our sleeves and figure out, what are they going to exempt? Are they going to stop payments for certain programs because there's no government worker to process it? That is what keeps me up at night right now.
Right.
oh, so the
So
continue.
so basically the funding stream could get cut off because there's no one to like turn on the spigot.
And historically hasn't been consistent with how that process works, how much, pain is going to be inflicted in
Yeah,
order to get a budget deal.
yeah,
But, we can't afford to push out the amount of federal spending that I just talked about and not get reimbursed for it, the same day.
Mhm.
And this has wider repercussions for every state's economy. The continuing, like if you have a government shutdown, there, I mean, what I mean by that is that, generally government employees are almost certain to be paid retroactively if they're like, basically uh, they're not being paid during the shutdown. But it's an open question sometimes on contractors. Um,
Well, think about farmers.
yeah.
May
Okay.
not get processed for their, subsidies that they're getting or their contracts that they've got with certain agencies for spending. Do those get cut off or do those still, does somebody in the USDA still sit there and cut those checks? Those
Oh.
are outstanding questions.
So we now we're getting into how interwoven federal dollars move through every state, every community, every industry, basically. That's something that maybe Marjorie we should have another Zoom on.
And we haven't really talked much about or at all about Doge and tariffs and cuts on, the cuts of federal workers and how that affects potentially the bottom line of like our tax base. And there's a lot of uncertainty right now, just in general about how um, the actions at the federal level could affect our economy.
Well,
But
tariffs,
Tariff.
somebody said
Yep.
tariffs today, and the LFC report to Senate Finance said New Mexico is the second most vulnerable to tariffs with all the produce and manufacturing flowing through Santa Teresa.
Yeah, I mean, because a lot of our, what is it, in the billions that New Mexico exports to Mexico and Canada, I think, and there'll be retaliatory tariffs. Yeah, that's going to affect the state economy. Federal workers, gosh, nearly 20,000, 20, 30, nearly 30,000 federal workers, and then you add another, what is it, 32,000? Is that right from the report? Who work at the labs, and if you have cuts there, that means unemployment. That means can the private sector absorb that many workers? There's all these kind of questions around this kind of stuff.
Lots of
so
uncertainty.
there's uncertainty at the federal level. We're in the strongest fiscal position we've ever been as a state.
Mm-hmm.
You're seeing an orderly budgetary process in the New Mexico legislature working with the executive. And we got to focus on what we can control right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that is using these resources to get better results for New Mexicans at the end of the day. And then we'll have to deal with any challenges that come our way when they come our way. And we're aware of them.
Yeah. We have an outstanding question if you guys have time.
Sure.
We were moving toward, this is from Aline Agouche. Hope I'm saying that correctly. I'm not sure that I am. We were moving toward getting Medicaid funding for acupuncture, which is covered in the statute, but never actually included in the state budget. Chiropractic started being covered in 2024, same kind of issue. Now it looks like we're blown out of the water again. This would make such a difference both for New Mexicans' health and to help stretch our healthcare workforce further. Oh, this is a comment. This is not a question. I apologize. It's just a comment. But I mean, this is an example of what is affected by the budgeting process, right? What's in, what's out, that kind of stuff.
Whether you should be expanding to something new at this point in time or trying to focus on what you've already got and maintaining it.
Mm-hmm. Patsy Romero has just asked a question. Thank you, Patsy. This is an interesting one. Going back to New Mexico budget, are you okay with the implementation of the Behavioral Health Trust Fund? That's an interesting question.
Well, it's been passed and signed, so it's law.
It is law. That's right. It is law.
That's another trust fund. It's another one of these funds that have been created that then will generate revenue that can be spent to
Yeah.
support. So it's another example of socking away money and then living or using the interest on it.
Using the interest to pay for it.
Yep, that's
Um,
right.
you know what? Honestly, this has been fantastic. What I'm thinking is that there is so much still to discuss. I mean, there's so much to the budget making process. I wanna just ask if you guys would be open to appearing later in the year as we move through and we have a little more certainty about, what the feds are doing as the federal budget process, or maybe even the continuing resolution. But as we get more certainty about that, we might send out an invitation to you guys again. And as well as to Wayne Probst, who is the DFA secretary, who has been, like both of you, decades in state government, really understands the budgeting process. With that, I just want to say, Marjorie, if you, I don't know if you have any closing
No,
comments.
I really appreciate the both.
We really appreciate this, and I have so many questions about the process because the state budget really does touch on so many communities, and the federal money as well is part of that state budget, and it's a big part. And thank you so much for appearing with us and taking questions. We really appreciate it. And I hope you guys have a great rest of the week. Charles, I hope you survive without getting the capital crud, which is going around as
Yeah,
usual.
it is.
People are getting sick. Um, anyway, thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and
Thanks
thanks
for having
everyone for
me.
joining.
Yeah, thank you everyone for all the questions.